Alright, do you guys remember the launch of Star Rail? Or for those of you that maybe weren't around back then, do you remember the start of your account? Do you remember the characters you used to use and the team comps you ran and how you cleared all the different content the game had? I mean, regardless of when you started, I'm sure all of those things were pretty vastly different compared to how you play the game now. For me personally, I was a day one player. I remember making my way through the early game with underleveled characters like Su Shang, Welt, and Sela. I remember struggling to clear Cocolia in World 6 of the Simulated Universe, and as my account slowly progressed, I started to feel that early game rush as I saw my characters get stronger and stronger. Like, my Sela ultimate that was dealing 4k damage at the start of the game eventually turned into doing like 30k, and I was like, whoa, I'm finally dealing a lot of damage. But I want you to think about what I said for a second there. 30k felt like a lot. Now, compare that to the current numbers you can see in Starro, where we've got characters doing 1,000,000 damage, which, at least personally, I'd consider decently high. Obviously, yeah, a lot of time has passed since the start of the game, and yeah, you could say that the amount of damage we deal going up is largely due to that time passing, or you could say it's due to Acheron. But regardless, overall I'd say it's given the impression that as time has passed, we've gotten stronger. That said, I want to pose a bit of a question here for you. Have we actually gotten stronger? I mean, yeah, our damage is higher, we've had more time to farm relics, get perfect sets, max out our traces, there's tons of broken characters now due to power creep and whatnot, but genuinely, I want you to really think about it. What has actually changed with the game to make us feel stronger? Like, if you take your MOC clears from, say, 2.0 in Penacony, and you compare that to right now in Amphorius, are you clearing any faster than you did back then? Have you gone from a 5 cycle to a 3 cycle, a 2 cycle to a 1 cycle? I mean, I'm sure you have here and there depending on the rotation of enemies and the characters you're using, but for the most part, if you've been consistently clearing all this time, your scores will undoubtedly be relatively similar to where they were back then. So, what gives? We've had a ton of time to work on our characters, right? I mean, we've got the new broken supports, didn't we? Our new DPS are dealing more damage than the old ones, aren't they? So, why was my clear back in Penacony 2 cycles, and my clear here in Amphorius is still 2 cycles? This is a question that I thought of the other day, and well, my conclusion was that our accounts haven't actually gotten stronger. In fact, I'd say it's the opposite, or at least it feels that way. There's a few reasons that I feel this has come about, so let's talk about it. The first thing I feel we need to talk about is something more related to game design, and some of you may remember this from an older video of mine discussing the idea of a power ceiling. In short, the idea of that video was to explain how a cap on the power necessary to clear content, or in other words a ceiling, could lead towards better balance for the game, as there wouldn't be a need for a new character to always be stronger than their predecessors. Something that I didn't discuss in that video is the opposite of that balance system, which is also the current balancing standard for most gacha games, which is a power floor that rises. In short, balancing by means of a power floor is the idea that as the game progresses and players get stronger, the game's base difficulty needs to increase to match the rate of account progression. In a normal game, this might be something like a New Game Plus, which offers a means for players to re-experience the game with their stronger pool of characters and gear while the game scales up around them, also they don't steamroll through all the content that the game has to offer. In gachas, this is something that is essentially in a constant state of flux and is also an extremely dangerous balancing system for the players of the game. For example, on one hand, say a gacha game is entering a new patch cycle, like how Genshin is releasing its 6.x cycle soon with Nod Cry. Those new patch cycles generally come with a marketing push to grab new players, so the game temporarily slightly lowers or at the very least stabilizes its difficulty for a little bit so that it's not as overwhelming for those new players and so that they can catch up. On the other hand, as patch cycles progress, the difficulty will usually start to increase to match the release cadence of new characters and new player account progression. The dangerous part from this balancing system comes from the fact that this relies on a step system. And to explain that point a bit further, as it might be slightly confusing, imagine it like this. As a patch cycle progresses and the difficulty increases, you may go from needing 1000 DPS at the start to 10,000 at the end. But when the new patch cycle starts and the marketing push happens to bring in new players, that stabilization in difficulty is now considered the new normal. Like, it's not going to go back to you needing 1000 DPS again, it'll go onward as the patch cycle progresses to you needing 100,000 damage. And that is how we got to where we're at right now, and why raising the floor is a dangerous system, and worse, it is very easy to increase that floor too fast. See, the problem is that you can never go back when you raise that floor because it's now normalized amongst the characters released after the increase, and as a result, you can only ever continue to increase it. With that said, personally I'd say that the floor raising isn't actually inherently bad. Like if 1000 DPS is necessary in the first patch cycle to clear content and the second is 2000, then that's not the worst thing. But when you get higher magnitudes of increases, it can very quickly become a problem. This is what led to HSR's issues in the past. Characters were released that broke what was considered normal damage, the floor necessary to clear content was raised to compensate, and as a result, you had people like me going, hey, wait a minute, why is it such a pain to get my Jingliu to clear content now? This is why I will always advocate for balancing based around a hypothetical peak of power or a ceiling, for example that could have been Emanators in HSR, rather than raising the base floor of damage to the tier of those characters and then further beyond that. Like, the new normal might be normal, but that doesn't mean it's actually a good normal. With all that said, that's actually not the whole of it, because the broken supports I mentioned earlier play a pretty big part too. I'm sure all of us have heard about the wheelchair comp by this point, but I want to actually expand on that a little bit. It is really easy to look at Hyacine and Tribi right now and say, yup, that combo is broken.
Oh my god, bro. Oh, hell no, man. What the fuck?
And then extrapolate that to those two characters being a huge problem with the game's balance. While they are undoubtedly broken, honestly, I don't actually consider those characters specifically to be a problem. Before you get your pitchforks, let me explain. See, wheelchair comps have always been a thing. At the beginning of the game, you'd slap Tingyun and Bronya in every team you could. Later on, Ranmei and Huohuo were slotted in, and then over time, the wheelchair characters would go through a few changes, ultimately settling on Robin, Sunday, and Huohuo near the end of 2.x, before more recently swapping over to Tribi, Sunday, and Hyacine in 3.x. Characters and team compositions have always had good synergies, and it all just depends on the current meta. Hyacine and Tribi are just the most recent ones. Like, I would genuinely be shocked if we go for more than a few more patches without at least one of those characters being swapped out for something new, most likely Cyrene, and it'll just depend on the meta that Hoyo decides to make prominent at that time. So with that said, the point I'm trying to make here is that it's not necessarily the characters themselves that are the real problem with wheelchair comps. The problem is instead the idea that a wheelchair comp exists at all, and further, that they're now the outright best thing you can have for a character, rather than being the optional but best thing you could have. I will say on paper, it's not the worst thing in the world, right? Like maybe your favorite character is somehow still Arlen. What a wheelchair comp will do is make him quote unquote playable, but I mean the whole idea behind a wheelchair comp is that you're essentially just dragging Arlen across the finish. Like it's not actually Arlen that's playable there, it's your Hyacine and your Tribi and your Sunday doing the brunt of the work. In the past, it was Sunday and Robin giving your Arlen a ton of turns, and before that it was Bronya, Tingyun, and Huohuo doing energy funneling to overcompensate for the damage that he couldn't do.
And I've got to say, in all honesty, it's the biggest piece of dog shit.
The biggest problem with this, and why wheelchair comps are a problem as a whole in my eyes, is because of one thing, and that's player choice, or I guess the lack of it. This can be expanded on in a few ways, but to start, let's just quickly talk about off-meta characters. Like I mentioned with Arlen, the only way you're realistically ever going to get a clear with the guy in the current game state is with the wheelchair comp. If you don't like the wheelchair comp, well, that's too bad, I guess you don't get to play Arlen. What this does is force you to get things you might not want, and it feels worse because you might have already gotten the last wheelchair comp. Which brings me to the second point, which is that those team compositions can change at any point, and that isn't amazing for the average player. But simply, it takes away your rolling choices. Like, if you want to play character A, then you need character B. Once character C releases and it's the new wheelchair character, then you'll need character C, and that's exactly how we got the evolutions of the wheelchair comp I mentioned earlier. You always have to keep updating your team composition, and as a result have less currency available to spend on what you might actually want to spend it on. Now, that's not to say you can't roll for parts of the wheelchair comp, like maybe Hyacine is one of your favorite characters, but the intended wheelchair comps work so well together that it makes most of the possible substitutes magnitudes of levels worse than what the intended comp will be doing, so as a result, you are really pushed towards getting the actual group of characters. Lastly, even new characters aren't immune to this wheelchair system because the new unit releases are generally catered to work with whatever the new broken supports are. While they do get some leeway because they're the new normal of DPS, you're definitely still incentivized to go for the full wheelchair team comp. What happens with all this is that characters end up being a reason to roll for other characters. Like, instead of being able to slot characters into different team compositions where you want, you now have to slot them into teams that Hoyo wants them to be played in. You can no longer play the game in the manner of like, oh, I'll just get Maide, why not? Because Maide now needs the current wheelchair built for HP scaling teams, so you can't just get Maide, you have to get all the characters that play with him. And this is even further exemplified by buffs, and particularly the Jingliu one that recently happened. Not to beat a dead horse here, but Jingliu turning into an HP scaler made her immediately swap teams from the old attack scaling wheelchair directly into the HP scaling wheelchair that all the new characters like Castoris and Maide use. As a whole, at least in my opinion, this has made the game feel relatively cookie cutter. Like, I know when the next attack scaling DPS releases, their team comp will most likely be Sunday, Robin, and Hoyo. I know when the next HP scaling character releases, my team comp will be the current wheelchair. Once a new support releases, I know they'll probably slot directly into the team of the newest hot DPS to be a part of whatever wheelchair is carrying that character. And at least for me, I feel this has taken pretty much all the player engagement out of the equation in relation to meta and team compositions, and that honestly feels really weird. It doesn't feel like I can go and figure out a team on my own anymore because the best team for the character will probably end up being the exact team that Hoyo wants you to play. It almost makes me feel like actually thinking about what you're doing in the game nowadays doesn't have much of a point. Like, it doesn't feel like there's a point of theory crafting anything when the HP character goes with the HP team and the attack character goes with the attack team.
That's right, the square hole.
I mean, before a character releases, as long as we know what they scale off of, we know exactly how they'll play because we know exactly what teams they're played in. My problem with all this is that each and every point I've talked about in this video goes back to one thing. None of this is really in our control as players. Like, at any point, the power floor can be increased with a new tier of characters. A new character that will replace someone in the wheelchair comp can come out at any time. And as a player, that results in always feeling like you have to chase after those new things and those new levels of power to remain relevant with your account. So, to go full circle here, our accounts haven't gotten stronger at all as the game has progressed because the floor has risen beyond the capabilities of what our accounts previously could do. As that has happened, the new characters that released have had their power increased to go beyond the new floor, which again creates a new normal of strength that your account is expected to have, so that it can clear content and a new set of units that are needed to wheelchair older units into relevancy. So, while we haven't necessarily gotten weaker, because like I said at the beginning of this video, someone who's kept up with the endgame will basically be clearing in the exact same amount of time or cycles, it can definitely feel that way sometimes because the game has also definitely moved away from the idea that you can play it how you want to, and as a result, the game's meta just feels weird. I do have to say, it's not inherently a bad thing for the game to be this way, because if you can just get the newest wheelchair comp and play your favorite character forever, then I guess that's fine. And if the wheelchair team composition is full of characters you like, then that can be a bonus too. But at least personally, I feel the way the meta has developed over the course of the game hasn't necessarily been for the best. Honestly, it really makes me feel like the meta is stale, or I guess less interesting at the very least, and as a result of that, at least personally, it makes it pretty difficult for me to actually care about the current state of the meta. When I know how every piece of the puzzle fits together before I even touch it, it almost makes me feel like there isn't actually a reason to participate in the meta anymore, which actually brings me to my last point, which is something interesting that I noticed while playing recently. Like, while I have been critiquing the current meta state a lot here, surprisingly enough, I'm actually enjoying it somewhat. It is not a stretch to say that I've kept my nose out of the game's meta for a while now because I've been focusing more on story content and, I've just been busy. Nice. So it's been a bit weird looking at it from a different, or I guess more outside perspective than I normally would. Maybe the break from thinking about all this stuff has allowed me to mostly stop caring about how imbalanced things are, but honestly, I think it's just sometimes nice to open up the game and see big numbers characters can pull off now and look at the cool animations and stuff. I mean, it's been pretty obvious for a hell of a long time now that HSR's version of turn-based combat is really simplistic, so despite the flaws it may have, I've also realized it's not exactly unfun to play. With that said, the current state of the meta is definitely not how the game was originally, and whether or not that's a good thing will entirely depend on the person playing. For me personally, I'm enjoying it right now, but I can absolutely see why someone that cares a lot more about the meta would definitely be upset with the current state of it. I mean, hell, I was there not that long ago myself. Part of me really does miss the random team comps you could cook up at the beginning of the game, like with a regular break or even dual DPS comps for example, and hopefully in the future teams won't feel so rigid and cookie cutter and, you know, like a wheelchair. But at this point, I'm just enjoying the parts of the game that I actually do, and like I said, sometimes it's fun to just see a 1 million damage explosion from a dragon or, you know, a fat fuck splitting the sky. Anyway, that's all my thoughts, and I appreciate you listening if you made it this far. If you have some thoughts of your own about this topic, I'd love to hear about it, so feel free to leave a comment down below or join my Discord link down in the description to talk with me about it. As usual, thank you so much for watching, subscribe, and if you haven't already, maybe give one of the videos a shot too.